A 4-year-old street urchin finds a millionaire being treated like a dog by mobsters, but she saw everything and did something that shocked everyone. Comment with a rating from 0 to 10. For my story, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The rain fell like icy tears on the grey asphalt of the sprawling metropolis, creating small rivers that ran through the gutters, carrying the debris of yet another cruel day. Among the shadows of the upscale business district, where glass towers reflected the neon lights of expensive establishments, a tiny figure huddled behind a dumpster, trembling not only from the cold, but from the constant fear that had become her most faithful companion. The 4-year-old girl, who looked no more than 2 due to the severe malnutrition that marked her frail body, watched the movement of elegant people hurrying by, carrying shopping bags from pricey stores and talking on their phones about multi-million-dollar deals. Her chestnut hair, once silky, was now tangled and dirty, forming small knots that she no longer had the strength to untangle. The clothes she wore were much too large for her skeletal frame, a donation from some compassionate stranger who had found them weeks ago in a trash bag. 2 years had passed since her mother mysteriously disappeared, leaving her alone in the world without explanations or goodbyes. The memory of that day still haunted her on cold nights. She woke up in their small apartment in Queens and simply couldn't find the woman who was her entire universe. She waited for days, then weeks, until the neighbors called the authorities, and she ended up on the streets, fleeing a system that didn't understand her pain. Now she survived as best she could, developing an extraordinary ability to become invisible to the eyes of adults. She learned that crying drew unwanted attention, that begging insistently got her kicked out of places, that sleeping in very exposed locations was dangerous. Therefore, she had become a silent observer, a small ghost witnessing the lives of others unnoticed. On that particularly cold winter afternoon, as she sheltered from the torrential rain, her large, dark eyes caught a scene that would make her childish heart race in a way she couldn't fully understand. Across the street, in a narrow alley between 2 elegant commercial buildings, 3 hooded men surrounded a figure she immediately recognized. It was the handsome man she had seen a few times passing through that area, always impeccably dressed, always with a serious but gentle expression. He was tall, had neatly cut dark hair, and features that resembled the movie stars she used to see on the posters in movie theaters. But now that same man was kneeling in the mud, crying desperately as the 3 strangers laughed cruelly. "You know what you have to do if you want to keep your reputation intact," one of the men said, his voice filled with malice. "Grovel like the animal you are, bark like a dog, and maybe we'll consider reducing this week's amount." The 30-year-old entrepreneur, heir to a fortune built over generations and owner of a thriving construction company, obeyed with tears streaming down his face. He placed his hands on the wet ground and began to crawl, emitting sounds that resembled barking, as the men filmed everything with their phones, laughing like hyenas at wounded prey. The girl felt something strange grow inside her chest, a fury she didn't know, a rage that burned like fire. She knew all too well what it was like to be humiliated, knew what it was like to be treated as less than nothing. Every day, people passed her by as if she were a disposable object. Some threw coins on the ground for her to crawl after. Others shooed her away as if she were a dangerous animal. Seeing that elegant man, who clearly had money and power, being treated the same way she was treated daily, awakened in her a deep and disturbing identification. It wasn't just compassion, it was the recognition of a familiar suffering, the realization that humiliation and despair made no distinction between rich and poor. "Next time, we want double the amount," continued the man who seemed to be the leader. "And if you think about reporting us or trying any clever tricks, these images will end up in every newspaper in the city. Imagine what your partners will think when they see the powerful entrepreneur begging on all fours on the ground. The millionaire nodded in silence, his body trembling not only from the cold, but from a shame so deep that it seemed to corrode his soul. When the men finally walked away, he remained on the ground for long minutes, sobbing like a lost child, unaware that small eyes were watching every detail of that devastating scene. The girl remained hidden until he got up, wiped the tears with the back of his muddy hand, and walked slowly to his luxury car parked on the main street. She watched him drive away, but something inside her had changed forever. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel completely alone in the world. The next morning, the girl woke up with a determination she hadn't felt in a long time. The sun timidly peeked between the tall buildings, creating long shadows in the alley where she had spent the night curled up in wet cardboard. Her small bare feet were purple with cold, but a strange energy pulsed in her childish heart. All night long, she couldn't get the image of the elegant man crawling in the mud out of her head. There was something about that suffering that echoed her own, a pain she recognized even without fully understanding it. Therefore, she made a decision that would change both their lives. She would follow him. She walked through the streets until she reached the place where she had seen him the night before. The alley still smelled of humiliation and despair, but now it was empty, only with puddles of dirty water reflecting the grey sky. She positioned herself strategically behind an abandoned newsstand and waited, with the patience that only wounded children can develop. At 8:15 in the morning, the black luxury car appeared on the corner. The entrepreneur got out wearing impeccable clothes, as if nothing had happened the night before, but the girl could see beyond the facade. His eyes were swollen. There was a tension in his shoulders that didn't exist before, and he constantly looked over his shoulder, like a wounded animal expecting the next attack. He entered a tall and elegant commercial building, where large golden letters announced the name of his construction company. The girl approached the main entrance, observing the movement of well-dressed people entering and leaving with leather briefcases and serious expressions. It was a world completely different from hers, a universe of power and money that seemed unattainable. But she had learned on the streets that all places had their loopholes, their blind spots. She went around the building until she found a service entrance, where cleaning staff were smoking cigarettes during their break. With her natural ability to become invisible, she managed to sneak into the building. The interior was even more impressive than she had imagined. Polished marble covered the floor, ornamental plants decorated the corners, and a golden elevator transported important people to the upper floors. The girl hid behind a large plant and watched, trying to understand how that world of wealth and business worked. It was then that she heard his voice for the first time. "I need you to cancel all the meetings this morning," said the entrepreneur to an elegant secretary. "I'm not feeling well." The voice was deep and tired, filled with a sadness that he tried to hide behind authority. The girl noticed that his hands trembled slightly when he signed some papers, and that he avoided eye contact with the employees. During the next few hours, she managed to find out more about his routine. His name was mentioned with reverence by the employees. They spoke about his company as one of the most prosperous in the city. They commented on his investments in stocks that generated astronomical profits. But the girl, with her perception sharpened by suffering, could see beyond the veneer of success. He was being destroyed from the inside. In the afternoon, when he left the building for lunch, the girl followed him, always keeping a safe distance. She watched how he walked hurriedly, constantly looking around as if he expected to be attacked at any moment. She saw how his hands sweated even in the cold, how he obsessively checked his phone, how his eyes jumped from one face to another in the crowd. The restaurant where he entered was expensive and sophisticated, with uniformed waiters and customers who talked about net worth and dividends, as others talked about the weather. The girl positioned herself outside, glued to the window, watching through the glass how he stirred his food without being able to eat. how he checked his phone every few seconds, how his legs swayed nervously under the table. It was during this observation that she realized something important. 3 men entered the restaurant and sat at a table near him. They were not the same as the night before, but there was something in their postures, in their looks, that made the girl's stomach turn. They didn't take their eyes off the entrepreneur, and there were cruel smiles on their faces. The handsome man noticed them too. His face paled instantly, his hands began to tremble visibly, and he knocked over the glass of water on the table. One of the men made a discreet gesture pointing to the phone, and the entrepreneur, with robotic movements, took his cell phone out of his pocket. The girl saw his lips move in a silent conversation, saw how he nodded several times, how his tears began to flow, even trying to keep them controlled. When he hung up, he remained motionless for a few minutes, looking at the plate of untouched food as if it were an impossible enigma to solve. He paid the bill hurriedly and left the restaurant, walking quickly through the streets as if he were fleeing something terrible. The girl followed him, staying in the shadows, watching how he stopped several times to lean on lampposts or walls, as if the air was not enough for his lungs. When he reached his car, she managed to get close enough to hear when he made a phone call. "Mom," he said with a broken voice, "I need more money. I know I've asked for a lot, but it's urgent." There was a long pause during which she could hear a female voice altered on the other end of the line. "No, I can't explain what it's for. Please trust me. It's all I have the right to ask." When he hung up, he hit his forehead on the steering wheel and cried like a lost child. It was at that moment that the girl understood the real dimension of what was happening. Those men were not just humiliating him out of cruelty. They were stealing his fortune, blackmailing him, destroying him financially while shattering his dignity. That night, as he drove home, she managed to follow his car, keeping hidden in the back of a delivery truck. She found out where he lived, an imposing mansion in the most elegant neighborhood in the city, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and protected by tall wrought-iron gates. But even all that wealth couldn't hide the despair that she had learned to recognize. The lights of the house went out early, but she could see shadows moving behind the curtains. She could imagine the man walking back and forth, consumed by anguish. The girl spent the night hidden in the gardens of the property, protected by darkness and silence. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel completely helpless. She had found someone who suffered like her, someone who needed protection as much as she did. During the following weeks, the girl established a surveillance routine that would have impressed even the most experienced detectives. She woke up before dawn, positioned herself strategically in the gardens of the mansion, and watched every movement of the entrepreneur through the illuminated windows. There was something hypnotic in her silent determination, as if she had found a purpose that justified her miserable existence. What she discovered in the first weeks of observation was even more disturbing than she had imagined. The handsome man, heir to a fortune that included investments in Bitcoin and diversified applications, was being systematically destroyed, not only financially, but psychologically. She saw him wake up in fright during the early morning, walking around the house like a tormented ghost, talking to himself and obsessively checking the locks on the doors. Through the windows, she could observe how he received calls that made him collapse. She saw when he took papers from a locked drawer and studied them with tears in his eyes, how he calculated numbers on an old calculator with trembling fingers, how he held his head between his hands in gestures of absolute despair. But it was in the 3rd week of surveillance that she witnessed something that made her understand the true extent of the terror that dominated his life. It was a rainy Thursday when she saw car lights approaching the mansion around 2 in the morning. 3 dark vehicles stopped in front of the gates, and she saw the entrepreneur open the front door even before they rang the bell, as if he was waiting for them. The men who got out of the cars were different from those she had seen in the alley and in the restaurant, but they carried the same aura of calculated cruelty. They wore expensive suits and spoke in low voices, but there was a violence contained in their movements that made the girl shrink even more behind the tree where she was hiding. "You're late with this week's payment," said the tallest man, who seemed to be the leader. "This disappoints us deeply." "I need more time," pleaded the entrepreneur, his voice broken by despair. "I've already sold part of the company's shares. I've already taken out loans against my assets, but I can no longer liquidate capital so quickly." "Time is a luxury you can't afford," replied another man, taking a phone out of his pocket. "Maybe it's time your employees found out what kind of man really works for them." The girl saw the entrepreneur collapse completely, falling to his knees at the very door of his luxurious house. "Please, don't do this. My company employs hundreds of people. They are not to blame for my father's mistakes." "Then get the money," said the leader with calculated coldness. "You have until Monday. 80 million in cash, or we start distributing your home movie to the entire city press." 80 million. The amount echoed in the girl's childish mind as an impossible number, greater than all the pennies she had managed to collect in 2 years of begging. She didn't fully understand the concept of so much money, but she knew it was enough to destroy that man completely. When the cars drove away, she watched the entrepreneur remain kneeling at the door for more than an hour, crying silently as if all the life had been drained from his body. It was at that moment that she made a decision that not even she could explain. She could no longer be just a silent observer. The next morning, for the first time, she dared to approach the gates of the mansion during the day. She hid behind the entrance pillar and waited until the entrepreneur left for work. When he passed by her, driving his car with eyes red from insomnia, she did something that surprised even herself. She waved shyly. He didn't see her, but she felt a strange connection, as if it were possible to transmit protection through invisible gestures. During the days that followed, she began to map the blackmailer's routine. She discovered that they met regularly in an abandoned parking lot on the outskirts of the city, always on Wednesdays at noon. Using her natural ability to become invisible, she managed to get close enough to hear fragments of their conversations. "The idiot still believes we're going to release him after he pays," one of them laughed, counting stacks of money inside a briefcase. "He doesn't know this is just the beginning. His father owed us much more than that," said another. "We're going to bleed this rich kid dry until there's nothing left." "And when he has nothing left to give?" asked the third. "Then we invent some criminal charges. With the photos we have, it will be easy to convince a jury that he was involved in his father's schemes." The girl felt a chill in her stomach upon hearing those words. They never intended to free the entrepreneur. The plan was to destroy him completely, steal all his fortune, and then frame him for crimes he didn't commit. That night, she made a desperate decision. Taking advantage of the fact that she knew every corner of the mansion's gardens, she managed to approach a back window that was always slightly open. It was the entrepreneur's private library, a quiet environment full of old books and important documents. With her heart racing, she sneaked into the house for the first time. The interior was even more luxurious than she had imagined. Persian rugs covered marble floors, valuable paintings adorned the walls, and antique furniture gleamed under the soft light of the lamps. But all that opulence seemed empty, haunted by the presence of the despair that permeated every room. In the library, she found piles of financial documents, bank statements, and papers on the main table that she couldn't read completely, but that seemed important. There were also photographs scattered, images that made her blush even without fully understanding their meaning, but that clearly showed the entrepreneur in humiliating situations. That's when she heard footsteps approaching. The entrepreneur was returning home earlier than usual, and she could hear him climbing the stairs with slow, tired steps. Desperate, she looked for a place to hide and found a heavy curtain behind which she managed to curl up. When he entered the library, she could see him up close for the first time. Even with all the tension and suffering, he was still an incredibly handsome man, with striking features that contrasted painfully with the expression of absolute despair he carried. He went straight to the table, picked up the photographs, and looked at them for long minutes, as if each image were a stab in his heart. Then he opened a drawer and took out a small silver revolver. The girl felt the world stop when she saw that gun. She didn't fully understand what she was witnessing, but her childish instinct screamed that something terrible was about to happen. The entrepreneur held the gun for long minutes, looking at it as if it were the only solution to all his problems. His hands trembled violently, and silent tears streamed down his face as he fought against thoughts that the girl couldn't understand, but that terrified her deeply. It was then that something inside her awakened a courage she didn't know she possessed. Without thinking about the consequences, she came out from behind the curtain and showed herself to him, small and fragile like a wounded bird, but with determined eyes that shone in the dim light of the library. The entrepreneur froze when he saw her. The gun fell from his hands onto the expensive rug, and he looked at her as if he were seeing an apparition. For several seconds, neither of them moved, both processing the impossibility of that encounter. Who are you?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse from crying so much. "How did you get in here?" The girl didn't answer immediately. Instead, she approached slowly, as she would with a wounded animal, and picked up the photographs from the table. She looked at them with her disturbing innocence, and then extended them to him. "They hurt you like they hurt me," she said with her weak little voice, but filled with a wisdom that shouldn't exist in someone so small. The entrepreneur looked at her with a mixture of shock and confusion. How had that skeletal, ragged child entered his house? How did she know about the photographs? And most importantly, how could she express so simply something that he couldn't admit even to himself? "You shouldn't be here," he said, trying to regain control. "It's dangerous. I need to call someone to take you home." "I don't have a home," she replied simply, sitting on the floor of the library as if it were the most natural place in the world. "I live on the street, but I saw when they made you crawl in the mud. I know how it hurts." The girl's words hit the entrepreneur like a punch in the stomach. Someone had witnessed his humiliation. Someone knew his most terrible secret. But strangely, instead of feeling more shame, he experienced something he hadn't felt in months: relief. "How long have you been watching me?" he asked, crouching down to be at her level. "Since that night in the alley. They made you bark like a dog. I know what it's like to be treated like an animal." During the following hours, an impossible conversation unfolded in the luxurious library. The entrepreneur, moved by a desperate need to share his burden, began to tell that strange child details that he hadn't revealed to anyone. He spoke about his father's illegal schemes, about the debts left behind, about how the criminal partners had waited for his departure to start the blackmail. The girl listened to everything with absolute attention, asking simple but penetrating questions that demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the situation. It was as if her experience on the streets had taught her to recognize predators and victims with terrifying precision. "My father built an immense fortune," he explained, running his hands through his hair. "Investments in stocks, real estate deals, even some applications in cryptocurrencies that yielded millions. But I discovered too late that part of the capital came from questionable sources." "And now they want everything?" she asked. "More than everything. They want to destroy me completely. I've already paid more than 200 million in 6 months, and they keep demanding more." The girl processed this information with her childish mind, but sharpened by survival. 200 million was a number she couldn't fully comprehend, but she knew it represented enough power to help thousands of people like her. Seeing all that wealth being stolen by cruel men awakened in her an indignation that she couldn't express in words. "Have you tried telling someone?" she asked. "Who?" They have proof of my father's crimes, and now they have these photos. If I speak, I'll end up in prison, and my company will be destroyed. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs because of mistakes I didn't even make." It was at that moment that the girl had an idea that would change everything. Her weeks of observation had given her information that even the entrepreneur didn't possess. She knew where the blackmailers met, knew their routines, had heard conversations that revealed important details about their operations. "I can help," she said simply. The entrepreneur looked at her as if she had gone crazy. "You're a child. You can't get involved in this." "They don't see me," she replied. "Nobody sees street children. I can go to places where you can't. I can hear things they wouldn't say near you." During the following week, an impossible partnership formed. The entrepreneur, moved by despair and irrational hope, began to provide the girl with information about the meetings scheduled by the blackmailers. She, in turn, used her natural ability to become invisible to collect details that could be useful. The first important discovery came when she managed to hide in the abandoned parking lot during one of the criminals' meetings. She heard full names, addresses, details about other victims who were being blackmailed simultaneously. She discovered that the scheme was much larger than they had imagined, involving dozens of wealthy entrepreneurs in the city. But the most shocking revelation came when one of the men casually mentioned something about the secretary who found out too much. The girl felt her heart race when she heard the description. A young woman, brown hair, who worked for the entrepreneur's father and had mysteriously disappeared 2 years ago. That night, when she reported her findings to the entrepreneur, she asked a question that changed everything. "Did you know a secretary of your father's named?" And she said the name she had heard in the conversation. His face paled instantly. "Yes, I knew her. She worked for my father for years. She was a very kind woman, always nice to me when I visited the office. But she disappeared suddenly, shortly after his death. We never knew what happened." "Did she have a little girl?" asked the girl, her voice almost a whisper. "Yes, she did. A beautiful girl, about 2 years old at the time." "Why are you asking that?" The girl remained silent for long minutes, processing a truth that was too big for her childish mind. Finally, with tears in her eyes, she said, "Because that secretary was my mother. And I think she didn't disappear on her own." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with implications that neither of them was prepared to face. The revelation fell on the entrepreneur like an emotional avalanche that left him completely disoriented. He looked at that fragile girl with wide eyes, slowly processing the impossible connections that fate had woven between their lives. The daughter of his father's secretary, the child who had disappeared along with her mother 2 years ago, was sitting in his library, offering help against the same men who had probably destroyed her family. "This can't be coincidence," he murmured, running his trembling hands over his face. You couldn't have found me by chance." The girl shook her head slowly, her tears falling silently on the expensive rug. "I didn't know who you were when I started following you. I just knew you were suffering like me. But now I understand why my mother disappeared." During the following hours, fragments of memories began to fit together like pieces of a macabre puzzle. The entrepreneur remembered how his mother had been nervous in the last months before her disappearance, how she asked strange questions about his father's business, how she seemed worried about something she couldn't explain. "She found out about the schemes," said the girl with a certainty that was frightening. "That's why they made her disappear, and they left me alone, so I would seem like just another street orphan." "But why didn't they hurt you too?" he asked, trying to understand the cruel logic behind everything. "Because I was too small. They thought I would die alone on the street, that I wouldn't be a problem. They didn't know I would survive and discover the truth. The entrepreneur felt a devastating mixture of guilt and anger grow in his chest. That child had spent 2 years suffering on the streets because of his father's crimes, had been abandoned to her own fate by the same men who were now terrorizing him. And now she was offering her help, risking her own safety to protect the son of the man whose business had destroyed her life. "I'm going to get her off the streets," he said with sudden determination. "You won't sleep in the cold anymore. You won't go hungry anymore. It's the least I can do." "No," she replied firmly. "If you do that now, they'll get suspicious. They might find out who I am and realize that we know about the connection. I need to continue being invisible until we manage to stop them." The strategic wisdom of that 4-year-old child continued to impress the entrepreneur. She had developed an intuitive understanding of how human predators worked, how they thought and acted. It was a terrible education for someone so small, but that could now be the key to defeating them. In the weeks that followed, the partnership between them intensified. The girl continued living on the streets during the day, but every night she met with him in the library to share information and plan their next moves. He began to leave food and clean clothes hidden in the gardens for her, small gestures of care that made her cry with gratitude. During one of those nocturnal meetings, she brought a discovery that completely changed their strategy. She had managed to overhear a crucial phone conversation in the abandoned parking lot. "They're planning something big for next week," she reported, her eyes shining with nervous excitement. "They're going to demand that you transfer your entire company to them. They said it's the only way to pay off your debt definitively." The entrepreneur felt his world collapse once again. His company wasn't just his assets, it was his legacy, the work of generations of the family, the source of livelihood for hundreds of innocent employees. "They want everything," he whispered. "They never intended to free me." "I know," said the girl, "but I heard something else. They're keeping all the evidence of your father's crimes in a specific place, and your photos too. Everything is together in a house on the outskirts." "How did you find out about that?" "One of them was complaining that he had to go there every week to pick up documents. He gave the exact address to the other." The entrepreneur looked at her with a mixture of admiration and terror. That child was collecting information with the efficiency of a professional spy, risking her life to help him recover his freedom. "But even if we know where the evidence is, how are we going to get it? Surely the place is protected." "I have a plan," she said with that terrifying determination that had become her trademark. "But you're not going to like it." During the following hour, she explained her plan with details that left the entrepreneur simultaneously impressed and terrified. The idea was extremely risky. It depended on perfect timing and her ability to infiltrate places where adults could never enter. "It's crazy," he said. "You could get hurt or worse." "I'm already hurt," she replied simply. "They've already taken everything from me. My mother, my home, my childhood. I have nothing left to lose." "Yes, you do. You have your life." "What life? Dying of hunger on the street, being shooed away like an animal every day? That's not living." Her words cut the entrepreneur's heart like knives. He realized that that girl had gone through so much suffering that death no longer frightened her. There was only one thing that still motivated her: the chance to avenge her mother and protect someone who was going through the same type of persecution that had destroyed her family. "If we do this," he said finally, "I promise that afterwards we'll find your mother. We'll find out what really happened to her." "Do you think she's still alive?" asked the girl, her small voice filled with a hope that hurt to hear. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "But I promise we'll find out the truth." That night, they finalized the details of the riskiest plan that either of them had imagined. The entrepreneur would use his financial resources and connections to create the necessary distraction, while the girl would use her invisibility skills to infiltrate the location where the evidence was kept. But neither of them was prepared for the discovery that awaited them in that house on the outskirts, a revelation that would change not only their lives, but also their understanding of what had really happened 2 years ago. When they said goodbye that morning, both knew that they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The game had changed, and now it wasn't just about survival, it was about justice. The day chosen to execute the plan arrived with a fine rain that made the streets slippery and increased the tension that already dominated both. The girl woke up before dawn, hidden in an alley near the house on the outskirts that they had identified as the place where the evidence was kept. It was an old and poorly maintained building, with windows protected by rusty bars and a garden overgrown with tall weeds. For 3 consecutive days, she had observed the routine of the place. She discovered that only one man remained there during the day, a burly guard who slept most of the time, waking up only to receive deliveries, or when the bosses appeared to pick up documents. On Wednesdays, he left for exactly 2 hours to have lunch at a nearby bar, leaving the house completely unprotected. On the other side of the city, the entrepreneur was preparing his part of the operation. Using part of the money that still remained from his assets, he had hired a private security company to create a situation that would force the blackmailers to come out of their hiding places at the same time. It would be a fictitious meeting about an urgent business that would supposedly yield millions in immediate profit. At 11:30 in the morning, the girl saw the guard leave the house walking lazily towards the bar. She waited 10 more minutes to make sure he wouldn't return, and then began her infiltration. The most difficult part was getting through the high fence that surrounded the property, but her experience on the streets had taught her to climb much more challenging obstacles. Once inside the grounds, she headed to the back of the house, where she had identified a bathroom window that was always slightly open. The interior of the house was dark and smelled of mold and cigarettes. Old furniture was scattered throughout the rooms, and piles of papers covered all available surfaces. But it was in the main room that she found what she was looking for, a small old safe hidden behind a shelf of dusty books. With her heart racing, she began to look for the combination. She remembered something she had heard during one of the conversations she had spied on. One of the men had mentioned that they always used the boss's date of birth for important codes. After several attempts, the safe finally opened with a soft click. What she found inside exceeded her most optimistic expectations. There were dozens of photographs not only of the entrepreneur, but of other wealthy men being humiliated in the same way. She found detailed financial documents, illegal contracts signed by his father, and a list with the names of all the victims who were being blackmailed. But the most shocking discovery was in a separate folder, marked with her mother's name. Inside, there were photos of the woman she vaguely remembered, accompanied by detailed reports about her daily routine, addresses where she lived, and even information about the time she took her daughter to the park. With trembling hands, the girl continued investigating the contents of the folder. She found handwritten notes describing the plan to eliminate the problem of the curious secretary, and reports about how they had monitored her movements for weeks before acting. It was then that she found something that made her stop breathing, a recent photo of her mother. The woman was clearly older and thinner, her face marked by suffering, but she was alive. The photo had been taken in some kind of medical institution, and on the back was written an address with the date of just 3 weeks ago. Her mother was alive. The girl felt a mixture of euphoria and terror take over her small body. After 2 years believing that she would never see her mother again, discovering that she was still breathing was like receiving an impossible gift. But the location indicated in the photo filled her with dread. It was a psychiatric hospital in the outskirts, an institution known for treating patients who had suffered severe trauma. Quickly, she began to photograph all the important documents with a disposable camera that the entrepreneur had given her. Each click seemed to echo through the silent house like thunder, increasing her anxiety. She knew she had limited time before the guard returned. It was when she was putting the last pieces of evidence back in the safe that she heard the sound of cars approaching. Her heart raced. The guard had returned earlier than expected, and he wasn't alone. She managed to close the safe and put the bookcase back in its original position, but the voices were already close to the front door. With desperate movements, she ran to the bathroom and began to try to get out through the window she had entered. "Something's wrong here," she heard the guard's rough voice. "The smell is different, and I'm sure I left that chair in another position." "You're paranoid," replied another voice that she recognized as being one of the blackmailers. "But let's check the safe anyway." The girl managed to get through the window exactly at the moment she heard footsteps heading towards the main room. She ran through the garden, keeping crouched down, using the tall weeds as protection, and managed to reach the fence at the back of the property. But when she was climbing out, she heard shouts coming from inside the house. "The safe has been opened! Someone's been here!" "Impossible!" "Only we know the combination. Then we have a traitor in the group, or someone discovered our hiding place." The girl finished climbing the fence and ran through the streets of the outskirts like she had never run in her life. Her small legs carried her automatically, guided by the pure instinct of survival, while her mind processed all the devastating discoveries she had just made. Her mother was alive but imprisoned in a psychiatric institution. The blackmailers had dozens of victims besides the entrepreneur, and their operations were much more extensive than anyone had imagined. And now they knew that someone had discovered their hiding place. When she finally reached the meeting point agreed with the entrepreneur, a small coffee shop in downtown, she was exhausted and traumatized, but she carried with her evidence that could completely destroy the criminal network that had ruined so many lives. The entrepreneur saw her arrive and immediately realized that something had gone wrong. She was paler than usual, trembling visibly, and her eyes carried a mixture of hope and terror that he had never seen before. "What happened?" he asked, pulling her to a table in the back of the coffee shop, away from the other customers. "I found everything," she whispered, taking the camera out of her torn blouse. "The photos, the documents, the list of all the victims, and I found something else." "What?" "My mother is alive." The silence that followed was loaded with emotions that neither of them knew how to process. The entrepreneur looked at that extraordinary child, realizing that she had risked her life not only to save him, but also to discover the truth about her own family. "Where is she?" he asked finally. "In a psychiatric hospital. They did something to her, something that left her broken. We're going to get her." "We can't, not yet. They found out that someone broke into the hiding place. They're going to be looking, and if they see us together, they'll find out everything." Once again, the girl's strategic wisdom impressed the entrepreneur. Even discovering that her mother was alive, she managed to stay focused on the bigger plan, understanding that acting impulsively could put everyone in even greater danger. In the days that followed the discovery of the evidence, the blackmailer's paranoia increased exponentially. The girl, using her natural ability to move unnoticed through the streets, observed how they completely changed their routines. The meetings in the abandoned parking lot ceased, the visiting times to the entrepreneur became erratic, and she noticed new faces circulating in the places where they used to meet. The entrepreneur, in turn, was living in an even greater state of tension. In addition to the constant pressure from the blackmailers, now he carried the weight of knowing that the mother of that extraordinary child was alive, but probably suffering in a psychiatric institution. Guilt consumed him during the sleepless nights, reminding him that his father's crimes had caused suffering to innocent people he didn't even know existed. It was during one of those tortuous nights that he received a call that made his blood run cold. "We know that someone broke into our storage location," said the cold voice of the leader of the blackmailers, "and we suspect you may know something about it." "I don't know what you're talking about," replied the entrepreneur, struggling to keep his voice controlled. "Of course not. That's why we decided to accelerate our plans. You have 48 hours to transfer 60% of your company's shares to our name, and another 50 million in cash. That's impossible. I've already given you practically my entire fortune. Then you're going to have to be creative. Sell your properties, take out loans, even sell your family jewels. Because if you don't comply, we're going to start distributing your photos to every newspaper in the city. And we're also going to tell some interesting stories about your participation in Daddy's business. When the call ended, the entrepreneur sat on the floor of his luxurious library and cried like a child. He had reached the absolute limit of his ability to resist. He had no more money to give. He wouldn't be able to liquidate so many assets in such a short time, and even if he could, he knew they would never leave him alone. That same night, the girl appeared at his window as she always did, but this time she found him in a completely different state. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by financial papers, obsessively calculating numbers that didn't add up in any way. "They changed the deadline," he said without lifting his eyes from the documents. "They want everything in 2 days." "It's impossible." The girl approached slowly and sat next to him, observing the numbers that represented the complete destruction of everything his family had built over generations. "Maybe it's time to use the evidence we got," she said softly. "How?" "If we try to report them, they'll release the photos before any authority can stop them. My reputation will be destroyed, my company will go bankrupt, and hundreds of people will lose their jobs. And if we don't try, the result will be the same. They'll take everything, and then they'll still destroy you for fun." The entrepreneur knew she was right, but the paralysis of fear had taken over him completely. 2 years of systematic blackmail had broken his ability to make risky decisions. It was then that the girl did something that changed everything. She picked up one of the humiliating photographs that was scattered on the table and observed it for long minutes. "Do you know why my mother found out about your father's crimes?" she asked finally. "No, because she loved me more than she was afraid. She knew that if she didn't do anything, the bad men were going to continue hurting other people, and one day they might hurt me too." The girl's words hit the entrepreneur like a lightning bolt. She was right. Courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about acting despite fear when something bigger was at stake. "Did she know she was going to get hurt trying to stop them?" he asked. "I think she knew, but she did it anyway, because some things are more important than our own safety." That morning they made the riskiest and most courageous decision of their lives. Instead of waiting passively for destruction, they would counterattack using the evidence they had collected. But they would do it in a way that the blackmailers would never expect. The plan was complex and depended on perfect timing. The entrepreneur would use his contacts in the press to organize a press conference where he would reveal everything. Not only about his own situation, but about the entire blackmail network that was operating in the city. Simultaneously, the girl would deliver copies of all the evidence to different authorities, ensuring that even if they tried to destroy some evidence, others would survive. But the riskiest element of the plan was personal. They would go to the psychiatric hospital to rescue the girl's mother, regardless of the consequences. "If we're going to expose ourselves completely," said the entrepreneur, "then at least let's reunite your family first." During the next 24 hours, they executed the preparations with military precision. The entrepreneur liquidated all the assets he could, not to pay the blackmailers, but to have enough resources to disappear temporarily if the plan went wrong. The girl mapped all possible escape routes and identified safe places where they could hide. On the morning of the day, marked by the blackmailers for the final delivery, instead of appearing at the agreed location with the money, the entrepreneur was in a crowded press room, accompanied by lawyers and authorities who had been informed about the situation. "During the last 2 years," he began, his voice trembling but determined, "I have been the victim of a network of blackmail and extortion that has been operating in this city for decades. Today, I am here to reveal everything. At the same time, the girl was executing her most dangerous part of the mission. Using the information she had found in her mother's folder, she managed to locate exactly where she was being held in the psychiatric hospital. With a courage that defied her age, she infiltrated the institution during visiting hours, mixed with family members of other patients. What she found in room 237 made her cry in a way she couldn't control. Her mother was there, thinner and more fragile than she remembered, but alive. She was sitting by the window, looking at the courtyard with empty eyes that didn't seem to recognize the world around her. "Mom," whispered the girl, approaching slowly. The woman turned slowly, and for a moment her eyes focused on her daughter's face. A flash of recognition passed through her features, followed by silent tears. "My little one," she murmured, extending her trembling hands. "You've grown so much." But before they could embrace properly, altered voices echoed through the corridor. The blackmailers had discovered where they were and were coming after them. "We have to get out of here now," said the girl, helping her fragile mother to stand up. "I can't. They said that if I left here—" "They lied about everything, Mom. About you, about me, about everything." It was at that moment that the door of the room opened violently, and the leader of the blackmailers appeared with 2 armed men behind him. "How touching," said the leader of the blackmailers with a cruel smile, watching the scene of the reunion between mother and daughter. The little orphan finally found her crazy mom. The girl positioned herself instinctively between her mother and the armed men, her small eyes shining with a fury that contrasted with her physical fragility. Even in the face of mortal danger, she showed no fear, only a fierce determination that impressed even the hardened criminals. "You lied to her," said the girl with a firm voice. "You made her believe she was crazy so that no one would believe what she knew." "Clever," admitted the leader. "Much more clever than we expected from a street kid. In fact, you've caused us some serious problems in the last few weeks." "How did you find us?" asked the girl's mother, her voice weak but with flashes of lucidity gradually returning. "Your visits didn't go unnoticed. In addition, our friend the entrepreneur just gave a very interesting press conference. Did he think he could expose us with impunity?" At that moment, one of the armed men approached and whispered something in the leader's ear, who smiled even more sinisterly. "It seems that things have gotten even more interesting. The press is loving the story of the courageous entrepreneur who faced the blackmailers. Too bad he won't live to see how it ends." The girl felt the world collapse upon hearing those words. Her partnership with the entrepreneur had put his life in danger, and now he was paying the price for trying to do the right thing. "What did you do to him?" she asked, her small voice filled with a rage that burned like fire. "Nothing yet. But as soon as we resolve this little family problem, we're going to visit him for a final conversation about loyalty and consequences." It was then that the girl's mother did something that surprised everyone present. Despite her fragile mental condition, she stood up with sudden dignity and faced the leader of the blackmailers directly. "You've already taken 2 years of my life," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "2 years of my daughter's life. You made her suffer on the streets while I rotted here, believing that I was crazy. But you won't take anything more from us." "How dramatic," laughed the leader. "Do you really believe you can do anything to stop us?" "A broken woman and a malnourished child. Maybe we can't stop you," admitted the mother, "but other people can. And they already know everything." The confidence in her tone made the leader's smile waver slightly. "What are you talking about?" "My daughter hasn't been working alone for the last few weeks. Every move of yours has been documented. Every crime has been recorded. And if anything happens to us, all that evidence will end up in the right hands automatically." It was a courageous lie, but said with so much conviction that the criminals hesitated. The girl looked at her mother with admiration, realizing that the woman she had lost was slowly returning, rebuilding her courage from the need to protect her daughter. In that moment of hesitation, something unexpected happened. Sirens began to sound outside the hospital, increasing in intensity rapidly. The armed men looked at each other nervously, and the leader ran to the window to check what was happening. "The press conference worked," whispered the girl to her mother. "The authorities came." But the joy was short-lived. The leader moved away from the window with an expression of absolute fury. "Change of plans," he said coldly. "You two are going to serve as our guarantee of exit. And if anyone tries to stop us, they're going to watch this family reunion end in a very unpleasant way." During the following minutes, a hostage situation developed in the psychiatric hospital. The blackmailers forced the girl and her mother to accompany them through the corridors, using them as a human shield while they tried to find an escape route that wasn't blocked by the security forces. But the girl, even in such a dangerous situation, continued to observe and plan. Her experience on the streets had taught her to always look for opportunities, even in the most desperate circumstances. When they passed the medication room, she noticed that the door was slightly ajar. When they were forced to go down the emergency stairs, she memorized every exit and every possible hiding place. Her childish mind worked like a computer, cataloging information that could be useful. It was on the ground floor of the hospital that the opportunity arose. The blackmailers stopped to discuss which exit to use, dividing their attention between the hostages and the security movement outside. In that moment of distraction, the girl did something that no one expected. Instead of trying to escape, she ran in the opposite direction, directly towards the group of authorities who were coordinating the operation outside. Her sudden appearance caught them off guard, but she began to shout crucial information about the location of the criminals and about her mother's situation. "They're on the east stairs. My mother is still with them. They have guns, but they're nervous." The confusion that followed was chaotic, but it worked in favor of the security forces. The blackmailers, deprived of one of their hostages and exposed by the girl's information, found themselves in a much more vulnerable position than they had expected. During the ensuing confrontation, the girl stayed with the officers, providing details about the criminals that only she knew, thanks to her weeks of covert observation. Every piece of information she gave increased the chances of capturing the men who had destroyed so many lives. When it was all over, 3 hours later, every member of the gang had been apprehended. The girl's mother was rescued, physically unharmed, though emotionally shaken by the traumatic experience. But it was upon their return to downtown that they received the news that would change everything once again. The businessman had vanished. He was at the precinct giving his statement when an armed group stormed the place, an officer explained. "They took him by force, and we haven't heard from him since." The girl felt her world collapsing again. After everything they'd been through, after finally reuniting with her mother and capturing the blackmailers, the man who had become her chosen family was in mortal danger. "They had other crews," she murmured, the realization hitting her like a punch. "The ones we caught weren't all of them. There must be others who want revenge." "Do you know where they might have taken him?" the officer in charge of the investigation asked. The girl closed her eyes, forcing her memory to review every detail of her weeks of surveillance. There were other locations, other meetings she had witnessed, other hideouts the criminals had casually mentioned in their conversations. "I know where they are," she said finally, a steely determination returning to her voice. "But this time, I'm going to need help to save him." The girl spent the next night in an improvised conference room at the central precinct, surrounded by city maps and seasoned officers who listened intently to every detail of her observations about the places where the criminals might have taken the businessman. Her mother was beside her, still fragile, but determined to support her daughter's mission to save the man who had become so important to their lives. "There's a warehouse in the industrial area that they mentioned frequently," the girl explained, pointing to a specific area on the map. "They always talked about it as a safe place for serious talks. And also a farmhouse 25 miles outside the city, where they took people who needed to be convinced about deals. The officer in charge of the operation, a middle-aged man with tired but determined eyes, studied the information carefully. "Are you absolutely sure about these locations?" "I am," she replied without hesitation. "I never forget anything I see or hear. I had to learn that to survive on the streets." Over the next few hours, reconnaissance teams were dispatched to check both locations. The girl insisted on accompanying the operation, arguing that her ability to move unnoticed could be crucial in locating the businessman without alerting his captors. "It's too dangerous," her mother protested, holding her small hand. "You've been through enough trauma." "He saved me when no one else cared," the girl replied with a determination that silenced all the adults present. "Now it's my turn to save him." The first location, the warehouse in the industrial area, proved to be a dead end. The place had been abandoned for months, with no recent signs of activity. But it was at the second location that they found what they were looking for. The farmhouse was situated in the middle of an isolated rural property, surrounded by dense woods that offered natural cover for illicit activities. Through remote surveillance equipment, the team confirmed the presence of several armed men and a luxurious car parked that matched the description of the businessman's vehicle. "He's there," the girl said, watching the images transmitted by reconnaissance drones. "I recognized two of the men guarding the entrance. They were at the secret meetings. The rescue plan was drawn up with military precision, but it included an element that no official operation would ever consider. The girl would serve as a distraction, using her innocuous appearance to approach the house and gather information about the situation inside. A child lost in the woods won't arouse immediate suspicion," she explained to the skeptical officers. "They'll think I'm just a girl who got separated from her parents during a hike." Despite her mother's objections and the obvious risks, the plan was approved due to the urgency of the situation and the lack of viable alternatives to obtain detailed information about the interior of the house. At dawn the next morning, the operation was initiated. The girl approached the farmhouse walking through the woods, pretending to be lost and scared. When she reached the property gate, she began to cry and shout for help, playing the role of a desperate child with a skill that impressed even the seasoned officers watching from a distance. Two guards came out to investigate the noise, finding an apparently harmless girl who was crying copiously while telling a story about having gotten lost from her parents during a family camping trip. "Please, help me," she pleaded between sobs. "I've been lost for hours, and I can't find my parents. Can you give me water and let me call them?" The men looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. A lost child was not part of their plans, and they knew they would have to deal with her somehow before she caused more problems. "Sure, sweetie," one of them said, forcing a gentle smile. "Come in, we'll help you." Once inside the property, the girl continued her performance while discreetly observing every detail of the house and its occupants. She counted 7 armed men, identified all possible exits, and most importantly, located the muffled sound of a familiar voice coming from a basement that seemed to serve as an improvised prison. It was the businessman. She could hear him talking, which meant he was still alive and conscious. But her most crucial discovery was realizing that the criminals were preparing to abandon the location. There were bags being packed, documents being burned, and a general atmosphere of urgency that suggested they intended to eliminate all evidence, including their only witness, very soon. "My parents must be very worried," she said innocently, as one of the men offered her a glass of water. "They said that if I got lost, I should look for a house and ask for help calling the police." The word police caused an immediate reaction among the criminals. They looked at each other with concerned expressions, clearly uncomfortable with the presence of an innocent witness who could connect them to that location. "No need to call the police," said the group leader, approaching her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll take you back to your parents ourselves." The girl immediately realized that she had made a mistake. The mention of the authorities had alerted the criminals, and now she was in real danger. But instead of panicking, her mind raced, looking for a way to signal her location to the rescue team and simultaneously buy time for the businessman. "That's so kind," she said, forcing a childlike smile. "But first, I need to use the bathroom. I've been holding it for a long time." During the precious minutes she spent in the bathroom, she managed to use a small mirror she found to reflect sunlight through the window, creating signals that she knew would be recognized by the surveillance team. It was a simple code she had learned watching police movies, but she hoped it would be enough to communicate that she had located the target and that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. When she came out of the bathroom, she found the criminals obviously prepared to leave. The weapons were on display, the expressions were tenser, and there was an urgency in their movements that didn't exist before. "Change of plans, sweetie," the leader said coldly. "You're going for a ride with us?" It was at this moment that the girl realized that she had underestimated the danger. They had decided to take her along with the businessman, probably to eliminate both witnesses in a safer location. But before they could put her in the car, deafening explosions echoed through the property. The rescue team had correctly interpreted her signals and launched the final attack. What followed was absolute chaos. Gunshots echoed through the woods. The criminals ran in panic, looking for defensive positions, and the girl found herself in the middle of a shootout that would decide the fate of all those involved. Amid the confusion, she heard the businessman's voice shouting her name from the basement. He had managed to break free from his bonds and was trying to find a way to escape. It was now or never. With all the courage she could muster, the girl ran towards the basement, dodging bullets and the chaos around her, determined to complete the mission she had started weeks ago when she decided to follow a troubled stranger crawling in the mud. The girl descended the basement stairs with her heart pounding, guided by the businessman's desperate voice who kept screaming her name between the deafening sounds of the shootout above. The basement was dark and damp, lit only by a dim lamp that swung from the ceiling, creating dancing shadows on the concrete walls. She found him tied to a metal chair in the center of the room, his face swollen from beatings and his clothes torn, but conscious and alert. His eyes widened as he saw her coming down the stairs. "What are you doing here?" he shouted over the noise. "It's too dangerous. You should have stayed away." "I came to save you," she replied simply, running to him and starting to work on the knots of the ropes that held him. "Like you would do for me." Her small, agile fingers, hardened by 2 years of survival on the streets, managed to loosen the ties with a skill that surprised even her. In a few minutes, the businessman was free, rubbing his sore wrists where the ropes had cut off his circulation. "How did you find me?" he asked, still processing the impossibility of that situation. "I always watch everything. I remembered all the places they mentioned." She looked around the basement, looking for an alternative exit. "There's a door back there. Where does it lead?" They went to the door she had identified, discovering that it led to a narrow tunnel that apparently had been used for storage. The tunnel was too tight for an adult, but perfect for a small child. "You'll have to go alone," said the businessman, realizing the situation. "Follow the tunnel to the end and find the rescue team. Tell them where I am." "No," she replied firmly. "Either we go together, or I don't go." The shootout above was intensifying, and they could hear voices approaching the basement stairs. The criminals were being cornered and would probably try to use the businessman as a human shield to negotiate their escape. It was then that the girl had a desperate but brilliant idea. "Do you trust me?" she asked, looking directly into his eyes. "With my life," he replied without hesitation. "Then pretend you're still tied to the chair. When they come down, I'll create a distraction. You take the opportunity to disarm one of them." "That's crazy. You could get hurt." "I've been hurt a lot in my life, but I've never had someone worth saving." Before he could protest, she pushed him back into the chair and quickly repositioned the ropes to make them appear to be holding him. Then she ran to hide behind some old boxes in the corner of the basement. A few minutes later, heavy footsteps descended the stairs. Two armed men appeared, clearly nervous about the situation that was rapidly deteriorating above. "We're going to have to use you as a bargaining chip," one of them said to the businessman. "The situation upstairs isn't good for us." "They won't negotiate with me," replied the businessman, trying to look defeated. "I'm not important enough." "You will be when they find out we also have the kid," said the second man, looking around the basement. "Where is she? Didn't we bring her here?" It was at this moment that the girl emerged from her hiding place, but not in the way the criminals expected. Instead of trying to escape, she ran directly towards the nearest man, screaming like a small and furious beast. The surprise was total. The man instinctively lowered his weapon to try to hold the child who was throwing herself against his legs, and at that moment of distraction, the businessman broke free from the false ropes and lunged at the second man. What followed were a few seconds of absolute confusion. The girl continued screaming and struggling, making it impossible for the first man to aim his weapon accurately. The businessman fought hand-to-hand with the second criminal, using his weight advantage and the strength of desperation. When the dust settled, both criminals were unconscious on the floor, and the businessman was holding two weapons that could guarantee their escape. But his first instinct was to run to the girl and check if she was hurt. "Are you okay?" he asked, quickly examining her for injuries. "I am," she replied, but her voice trembled slightly. The adrenaline of the situation was finally affecting her seemingly infinite courage. The shootout above had ceased, replaced by authoritative voices shouting commands and approaching sirens. The rescue operation had been successful, but they still needed to get out of the basement and identify themselves to the security forces without being mistaken for criminals. "Let's go up slowly," said the businessman, guiding her up the stairs. "Keep your hands visible and let me speak first." When they emerged from the basement, they found the farmhouse completely controlled by the authorities. Criminals were being arrested at various points on the property, evidence was being collected, and an atmosphere of relief permeated the place. The girl's reunion with her mother was emotional. The woman ran to her and hugged her with a force that seemed to want to compensate for all the lost hugs during 2 years of forced separation. "I thought I had lost you forever," cried the mother, covering her daughter's small face with kisses. "You are so brave, so strong. I don't know how you did all this." "I learned that when you love someone, you do anything to protect that person," replied the girl, looking at the businessman who watched the scene with tears in his eyes. It was at that moment that the officer in charge of the operation approached the group with a serious expression on his face. "We have some important news," he said. The investigation revealed that the criminal organization was much larger than we imagined. We found evidence that they had been operating for over 10 years, with dozens of victims and millions in stolen assets. "And my father?" asked the businessman. "What exactly was his involvement?" "That's the complicated part," replied the officer. "The evidence suggests that your father was not a voluntary criminal. He was also being blackmailed for over 15 years. His participation in illegal schemes was forced, not chosen. The revelation hit the businessman like a lightning bolt. For 2 years, he had carried the guilt for the crimes he thought his father had committed voluntarily. Discovering that the man he admired had also been a victim of the same organization completely changed his perspective on everything. "That means all my fortune," he began, "is legitimately yours," confirmed the officer. "And with today's arrests, you will also be able to recover everything that was stolen through blackmail." But for the girl and her mother, the most important news was yet to come. 3 weeks after the rescue operation, life had changed drastically for everyone involved, but not all the changes were as expected. The businessman was temporarily living in a luxury hotel while his mansion underwent security upgrades. But he discovered that recovering his fortune was not a simple or quick process. The lawyers explained that it would take months, perhaps years, to unravel all the assets that had been transferred through blackmail. The girl and her mother were staying in a small but comfortable apartment that he had rented for them, but adapting to normal life was proving more difficult than anyone had imagined. The mother, after 2 years of forced psychiatric treatment and inadequate medication, struggled with episodes of severe anxiety and moments of mental confusion that left her temporarily lost in her own reality. "Sometimes I wake up and I don't know where I am," she confessed to the businessman during one of his visits to the apartment. "2 years believing I was crazy have left deep scars. There are moments when I question whether all of this is real or just another episode." The girl, in turn, was facing her own challenges. After 2 years living on the streets, developing survival skills, and keeping constantly alert, she couldn't relax in the safety of the apartment. She slept poorly, startled easily at normal sounds, and had difficulty trusting that food would always be available, hiding pieces of bread under her bed like she had done during her days of homelessness. "She wakes up several times during the night to check if I'm still here," the mother reported with tears in her eyes. "And sometimes I find her sitting by the window watching the street as if she were waiting for someone to come and get us." But the most unexpected challenge came from a direction none of them had foreseen. During one of the follow-up investigations, the lawyers discovered that the girl's mother had signed documents at the psychiatric hospital that transferred legal custody of her daughter to the state. The papers had been signed during one of her periods of greatest mental confusion, when she truly believed she was too crazy to care for her own child. "The problem is that these documents are still legally valid," the businessman's lead attorney explained during a tense meeting. "To reverse them, we'll need to prove that she wasn't in a mental state to make that decision, which could take months and require extensive psychiatric evaluations." "And in the meantime?" asked the businessman, seeing the despair growing in the eyes of the girl's mother. "In the meantime, the child is technically in state custody. They could decide to place her in a foster home until the situation is resolved." The possibility of separating mother and daughter again, after everything they had faced to reunite, was unacceptable to everyone involved. But state bureaucracy wasn't impressed by heartwarming stories or extraordinary circumstances. It was during this crisis that the businessman made a decision that surprised even himself. "I want to become the girl's temporary guardian," he announced during the meeting with the lawyers, "until the mother's situation is regularized." "This is very complex," the attorney cautioned. "You have no family ties with her, you're not married, and your own financial situation is still being investigated by the justice system. But I have the means to take care of her, and she trusts me. More importantly, it would allow her to remain close to her mother during the legal process." The idea generated heated discussions among everyone involved. The girl's mother felt grateful for the proposal, but also guilty for not being able to protect her own daughter. The girl, when she heard about the possibility, reacted unexpectedly. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone," she said with a disturbing maturity. "I've already caused too many problems for you both." "You're not a burden," replied the businessman, crouching down to her level. "You saved me in every possible way. You saved my life, my company, my sanity. If anyone here owes debts, it's me to you. But what if your life goes back to normal? What if you meet a beautiful woman and want to get married? A child who isn't even your daughter will get in the way of everything." Her words revealed a painful understanding of how the world worked, based on observations of people who had rejected or abandoned her during her 2 years on the streets. She had learned not to create expectations about the permanence of relationships. "Listen carefully," said the businessman, holding her small hands. "Family isn't about blood or legal papers, it's about choice, and I choose you both. Always." The legal process that followed was lengthy and complicated, but it had an unexpected result. During the investigations into the mental competence of the girl's mother, the lawyers discovered evidence that the treatment she had received at the psychiatric hospital was not only inadequate, but intentionally harmful. The medications they administered to her for 2 years were known to cause mental confusion and memory loss, explained the independent psychiatrist who was hired to evaluate her case. It wasn't treatment, it was a systematic way to keep an important witness in a state of mental incapacity. This discovery not only validated the fight to reverse custody, but also paved the way for additional lawsuits against those responsible for the hospital and the doctors who had participated in the conspiracy. During these months of legal battles, something beautiful happened between the three of them. They became an unconventional but genuine family. The businessman learned to divide his time between rebuilding his company and taking care of 2 people who had become more important to him than any fortune. The girl's mother, gradually regaining her lucidity and mental strength, began working as a consultant for other victims of similar crimes, using her terrible experience to help others. And the girl slowly began to act like a normal child. She still maintained her sharp intelligence and her extraordinary observation skills, but she also began to play, to laugh for no reason, to have occasional tantrums, and to ask to watch cartoons. Yesterday she asked me to buy her a teddy bear, the mother told the businessman with tears of joy. It's the first time in 2 years that she's asked for something just because she wants it, not because she needs it to survive. But it was during a seemingly ordinary night that the greatest revelation of all came to light, a discovery that would forever change their understanding of how their lives had intertwined so improbably. The girl was playing in the apartment when she found an old box of photographs that had belonged to her mother. Among the images, there was a photo of a company party from many years ago where her mother appeared smiling next to an older man that she immediately recognized. "Mom," she called, holding up the photograph. "Who is this man next to you?" The mother looked at the image and her expression changed completely. "That's Mom's old boss before you were born. He was always very kind to me, helped me a lot when your father abandoned me." "What was his name?" "His name was the same as the handsome man who helped us. It was his dad." The revelation about the connection between the businessman's father and the girl's mother created a strange atmosphere in the small apartment. The mother remained silent for long minutes, holding the photograph with trembling hands, while memories long buried began to resurface in her still fragile mind. "He helped me when he found out I was pregnant and alone," she said finally, her voice laden with complex emotions. "He gave me a job at the company, helped me pay for the doctor, even lent me money for the apartment where we lived." The girl looked from the photograph to her mother, trying to process information that was too big for her childish mind. "Why have you never told this to his uncle?" "Because I didn't know if he would remember me. And after everything started to go wrong, when I discovered the crimes, I thought he might think I was trying to take advantage of his father's kindness." When the businessman arrived at the apartment that night, he found mother and daughter sitting on the sofa, surrounded by old photographs scattered on the coffee table. The atmosphere was charged with a tension he couldn't immediately identify. "Did something happen?" he asked, noting the serious expressions on both faces. The girl got up and walked to him, holding the photograph that had triggered all that revelation. "You knew my mother from long before all this happened." The businessman took the photo with curiosity, and his face paled as he recognized the image. It was a company party from almost 6 years ago, shortly after his mother had started working for his father. He vaguely remembered that event, but had never paid much attention to the employees who worked on the lower floors. "My God," he murmured, looking from the photograph to the girl's mother. "You were pregnant at this party." 4 months, she confirmed. "Your father was the only person who cared when the girl's father abandoned me. He gave me an opportunity when no one else would hire a pregnant single woman." The businessman sat down heavily in an armchair, processing the implications of that discovery. His life had crossed paths with theirs long before anyone imagined. Destiny had woven connections between them that went back to the girl's birth. "Why did my father never tell me about you specifically?" he asked. "Because he was discreet about his acts of kindness, and because in the last months before his departure, he was very worried about something. He stopped talking to employees, stayed working very late, always seemed nervous. That's when the blackmailers started pressuring him." The businessman understood. "He must have realized that you were discovering too much about the forced business." "I didn't want to discover anything," she said, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I just wanted to do my job and take care of my daughter. But when I started seeing strange documents, suspicious transfers, meetings with men who gave me chills—" "You tried to protect him," the businessman understood. "Like you tried to protect me later. And that's why you two suffered for 2 years," said the girl with a disturbing wisdom. "Because they wanted to punish my mother for trying to do the right thing." In the weeks that followed this discovery, the dynamics between the three changed subtly. There was now a sense that their destinies were intertwined in a much deeper way than chance would explain. The businessman began to tell stories about his father to the girl, stories about the kindness he demonstrated in small gestures that weren't always publicly visible. He used to leave envelopes with extra money in the paychecks of employees who were going through hard times, he said. He never signed his name, never expected recognition. He said that true generosity was anonymous. "Like you're doing with us," observed the girl's mother. "You're more like him than you imagine." But it was during one of these conversations that the girl asked a question that would change everything once again. If his uncle's father was so good, why didn't he save my mother when he found out she was in danger? The question hung in the air for a few moments, creating an uncomfortable silence. The businessman realized that there were aspects of the story that they still didn't fully understand. "Maybe," he said slowly, "he tried to save her, but he couldn't." It was this possibility that led them back to the legal files and the evidence collected during the investigations. Looking for clues about the last weeks of the businessman's father's life, they made a discovery that left them speechless. Among the personal documents that had been recovered from the criminals, they found a handwritten letter dated a few days before the businessman's father's departure. The letter was addressed to a lawyer in the city and contained very specific instructions. "If something happens to me," the businessman read aloud, "I want you to look for my employee and her small daughter. They may be in danger because of information she obtained unintentionally. Provide protection for them, and use my emergency fund to ensure that the child has education and opportunities." The letter continued with detailed instructions on how to locate mother and daughter, precise physical descriptions of both, and even the address of the apartment where they lived at the time. "He tried to protect us," whispered the girl's mother, touching the letter with reverence. "Even knowing he was in danger, he thought of us. But the letter was never delivered," said the businessman, examining the postmarks. "It was intercepted before it reached the lawyer." The discovery revealed that the businessman's father had not only been a victim of the same criminal organization, but had also desperately tried to protect others who could be harmed by his situation. His failure to save the girl's mother was not for lack of trying, but because the criminals were monitoring all his communications. "That means you two suffered not despite my father's efforts, but because the criminals discovered those efforts," the businessman understood. "They punished you to punish him." The girl, listening to all this, began to cry, not out of sadness, but out of a complex emotion that mixed relief, anger, and something akin to peace. "So no one abandoned us on purpose," she said between sobs. "The grandfather I never met tried to save us. My mother tried to protect everyone, and you came to find us when you could." "Exactly," said the businessman, hugging her. We're a family that took years to find each other, but that was always destined to be together. It was that night that they decided to legally formalize what was already real emotionally. The businessman would begin the process of adopting the girl, not as a replacement for her biological mother, but as an additional father in an unconventional but genuine family. But there was still one last surprise waiting for them, a discovery that would make their story even more extraordinary. 6 months after the revelations about the intercepted letter, life had finally begun to take a more stable shape for the three of them. The businessman had recovered much of his fortune through legal proceedings, his company was thriving again, and he had bought a spacious house where everyone could live comfortably together. The girl's mother had officially regained legal custody of her daughter and was working as a coordinator of a support program for victims of financial crimes. The girl, now 5 years old, attended a private school where she could finally act like a normal child. She still maintained her sharp intelligence and extraordinary observation skills, but she had also learned to play with dolls, complain about food she didn't like, and ask for bedtime stories. It was during one of those quiet nights, while the businessman was reading her a book about adventures, that an unexpected visit arrived that would change everything once again. The doorbell rang late at night, and when the businessman opened the door, he found a distinguished-looking elderly man, accompanied by a younger woman carrying a leather briefcase. "Sorry to bother you at such a late hour," the man said. "My name is Dr. Sanders, and this is my legal assistant, Dr. Fremont. We are representatives of the private charity that your father maintained in secret." The businessman invited them in, intrigued. In the months of investigations into his father's life, he had never found evidence of organized, philanthropic activities. "Your father created our foundation more than 15 years ago," explained Dr. Sanders, sitting down in the living room. "It was completely anonymous, funded through a complex network of investments that generated dividends dedicated exclusively to helping families in specific situations." "What kind of situations?" asked the businessman. "Single mothers with small children facing extreme hardship, especially those who had tried to do the right thing in dangerous circumstances and suffered consequences for it." The girl's mother, who had come down to see who the late-night visitors were, paled at hearing this description. "For the past 2 years," continued Dr. Fremont, "our foundation has been searching for a woman and her small daughter who disappeared mysteriously after being involved in a situation that put their lives at risk." "You were looking for us?" asked the girl's mother, her voice almost a whisper. "We were. Your case was a top priority for our founder. He left very specific instructions about finding you and ensuring that you received all the assistance you needed." Dr. Sanders opened the briefcase his assistant was carrying and pulled out a series of documents that made the businessman catch his breath. "We recently discovered that our search has ended because you have already found each other. But there is something you need to know about the resources that were reserved for you." The first document was a bank statement from an account that had been created specifically for the girl's mother. The amount shown was sufficient to ensure a comfortable life for both for several decades. "This was accumulated during the 2 years that you were missing," explained Dr. Sanders. "Compound interest, stock dividends, profits from investments in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies that your father had specifically designated for this case." "But why?" asked the businessman, still processing the magnitude of the numbers in the documents. "Because your father discovered something about your employee's past that completely changed his perspective on moral responsibility." Dr. Fremont pulled another document from the folder, this one much older and yellowed with age. 17 years ago, when your employee was just a teenager, she witnessed a car accident involving an important businessman. Instead of running away or pretending she didn't see anything, she stayed at the scene, provided first aid, and gave testimony to the authorities about what really happened. The girl's mother covered her mouth with her hands, memories long buried beginning to resurface. "I vaguely remember that," she whispered. "I was just a kid. I saw a car crash into a tree, and there was an injured man inside. I stayed with him until the ambulance arrived." "That man was his father," said Dr. Sanders, pointing to the businessman. "You saved his father's life 17 years before you met him as an employee." The silence in the room was deafening. All those present were trying to process the statistical impossibility of so many connections between their lives. "Your father only found out about this years later, when he hired private investigators to research the history of all the employees who had demonstrated exceptional integrity. When he discovered that the woman who had saved him years ago was the same one who was risking everything to protect him from the criminals, he felt he had a moral debt that transcended any normal professional relationship. That's why he left such specific instructions about protecting us," understood the girl's mother. "Exactly. He felt that his life had been spared by your kindness, and that you were suffering for trying to protect him. It was a cycle of gratitude that he needed to close, even if it cost him his own safety." The girl, who had listened to the entire conversation from the top of the stairs, slowly descended into the room. Her presence brought everyone back to the present moment. "That means," she said with her disturbing childish wisdom, "that my mother saved my adoptive grandfather, then my adoptive grandfather took care of my mother, then my mother tried to save my adoptive grandfather, then me and my adoptive father saved my mother. That's a very accurate way to summarize 17 years of improbable connections," smiled Dr. Sanders. "But there's more," said Dr. Fremont, retrieving the last document from the folder. "Your father left instructions that if you were found and were safe, the foundation should be transferred to the control of the family you formed." The document was a detailed will that transferred control of the entire charitable foundation to the businessman, with the express condition that the girl's mother become the executive director, and that the girl, when she reached adulthood, would have veto power over all important decisions. "This means," said the businessman slowly, "that my father not only tried to protect us individually, but created a way to unite us permanently through a common purpose. He knew that true families are built through shared choices and mutual responsibilities," confirmed Dr. Sanders. "This foundation is his way of ensuring that you always have a reason to remain united and a way to transform all the suffering you've lived through into something that can help other people." That night, after the visitors left, the three sat on the porch of the new house, watching the stars and processing the extraordinary revelations about how their destinies had intertwined over nearly 2 decades. "Sometimes I wonder," said the girl's mother, "if all of this was really coincidence or if there was something bigger orchestrating our encounters." "It doesn't matter," replied the businessman. "What matters is that we found each other, and now we have not only a family, but a mission." The girl, sitting between the 2 adults who had become her heart's parents, looked at the starry sky with an expression of contentment that she hadn't shown for a long time. "I like our story," she said simply. "It started sad, but it ended happy." But she didn't yet know that the most beautiful part of her story was just beginning. 2 years had passed since the night of the final revelations, and the life of the unconventional family that destiny had united flourished in ways that none of them could have imagined. The girl, now 7 years old, had transformed into a radiant child who maintained her exceptional intelligence, but also demonstrated the natural joy that had been stolen from her during her first years of life. The charitable foundation had become one of the most respected institutions in the region, helping dozens of families facing situations similar to those they themselves had experienced. Under the executive direction of the girl's mother, who discovered she had a natural talent for administration and a deep understanding of the needs of people in crisis, the organization expanded its operations to 3 neighboring cities. The businessman, now officially the girl's adoptive father through a legal process that lasted 8 months, had completely restructured his company. A significant portion of the profits were automatically earmarked for the foundation, creating a constant flow of resources that guaranteed the sustainability of the social projects. His investments in stocks and other financial applications had fully recovered, but now he saw his wealth as an instrument of social transformation, not just personal accumulation. It was on a sunny Saturday morning that the girl made an announcement that caught everyone by surprise during breakfast in the spacious kitchen of her new home. "I want to do something special to celebrate our family," she said, carefully spreading jelly on her toast. "I want to find other children who are going through what I went through and help them too." "We already do that through the foundation, my dear," replied her mother, sitting down next to her at the large, light wood table. "No, Mom, I mean help personally, like Dad helped me when he first saw me." The businessman, whom she now called Dad with absolute naturalness, looked up from the newspaper he was reading. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to go out on the streets and look for children who are alone like I was, and I want our house to be a place where they can come when they need safety." The proposal was simultaneously touching and complex. Transforming their home into an informal reception point for homeless children would require significant changes not only in the physical structure, but also in their personal lives. "That would be a huge responsibility," said her mother, choosing her words carefully. "Caring for many traumatized children requires professional preparation, specific licenses." "Then let's get all that," interrupted the girl with the determination that had become her trademark. "The foundation can help us with the legal papers, and you can hire people who know how to take care of hurt children." During the following weeks, the girl's idea turned into a concrete project. They consulted psychologists specializing in child trauma, social workers with experience in foster care, and architects who could adapt the house to receive up to 6 children temporarily. But it was during one of these planning meetings that something happened that none of them expected. The girl was playing in the garden when she saw a small figure hiding behind the fence that separated her property from the street. It was a boy of approximately 4 years old, dirty and clearly malnourished, who was watching the house with an expression that she immediately recognized. It was the same desperate and hopeful look that she herself had carried during 2 years of life on the streets. Instead of calling the adults immediately, she approached the boy slowly, remembering how strangers had scared her when she was in a similar situation. "Hi," she said softly, crouching down to his level. "Are you okay?" The boy looked at her suspiciously, ready to run at the first sign of threat, but something in the girl's gentle voice made him hesitate. "I'm hungry," he said finally, his small voice almost inaudible. "I know what that's like," she replied. "Want a sandwich? My mom makes the best sandwiches in the world." Over the next hour, the girl managed to gain the boy's trust enough to find out his story. He had fled an abusive situation at home and had been living on the streets for 3 weeks. He didn't know where to go, he didn't trust adults, and he survived by eating scraps found in the trash. "You can stay here," she said simply. "My parents adopted me when I was in a similar situation. They're like you, too." When she finally brought the boy into the house, introducing him to her parents as our first special guest, the businessman and his wife, she had formalized the relationship through marriage 6 months earlier, looked at each other with a mixture of admiration and determination. "Welcome to our home," said the businessman, crouching down to greet the frightened boy. "Here you are, safe." The process of caring for the first street boy that the adoptive daughter brought home was challenging, but also revealing. He had developed survival behaviors similar to those that she herself had demonstrated: hiding food, extreme distrust, constant nightmares, and a hypervigilance that made him jump at the slightest noise. But under the patient care of a family that understood trauma because it had lived trauma, the boy began to transform. In 3 months, he was attending school, playing in the garden, and calling his caregivers uncle and aunt with genuine affection. "It's amazing," commented the psychologist who was monitoring the case during a routine visit. "The speed of his recovery is exceptional. You have a natural gift for this kind of work." "It's not a gift," replied the girl with wisdom beyond her 7 years. "It's just that we know exactly how he feels, because we've felt the same thing." During the following months, other children began to appear. Some were brought by the girl, who developed an infallible radar to identify children in vulnerable situations during her walks around the city. Others arrived through the Foundation's network of contacts, referred by social workers who had heard about the exceptional work that was being developed at that house. The property was expanded and adapted to accommodate up to 8 children simultaneously, with colorful rooms, a playroom, a small soccer field, and even a vegetable garden where the children learned to grow their own vegetables. But the most beautiful aspect of the entire operation was observing how the girl, now known by the younger children as Big Sister, used her own experience to help the newcomers adapt. "When I got here," she told a group of children during a community dinner, "I was also afraid that it was temporary. I also hid food under the bed. I also woke up at night thinking someone was going to hurt me." "But now you're not afraid anymore?" asked a 5-year-old girl who had arrived the week before. "Sometimes I still am," she admitted honestly. "But now I know that even when I'm scared, I have people who love me and protect me." And so do you. A year and a half after receiving the first child, the house had become a national reference for reception and recovery. Delegations from other cities came to study the methods used, universities sent students for internships, and the media began to regularly cover the activities of the extraordinary family that turned pain into healing. But for the residents of the house, success wasn't measured in public recognition or statistical numbers. It was measured in simple moments. A child laughing for the first time in months, a boy who finally managed to sleep through the night without nightmares, a girl who stopped hiding food because she finally believed that there would always be more. It was on a December night, during the house's year-end party, that the girl who had started it all made a speech that left all the adults present with tears in their eyes. "4 years ago," she said, standing on a chair so everyone could see her, "I was a scared girl who slept in the cold and didn't believe that anyone could love me. Today, I look around this room and see a family of 15 people who have chosen each other." She looked at her adoptive parents, who were embraced at the back of the room. "You taught me that family isn't about where you come from, but about where you choose to stay. And that true love is when you take the pain you felt and turn it into healing for other people." Then, addressing the younger children who were listening to her with absolute attention, she continued, "We all came here broken, but broken doesn't mean destroyed. It means we have places where the light can enter and leave." That night, while all the children slept in their safe beds, the 3 founders of the impossible family sat on the porch, watching the stars that had witnessed their entire extraordinary journey. "Sometimes I wonder where we would be if you hadn't followed me that first night," said the businessman to his adoptive daughter, who was now nestled between him and his wife. "It doesn't matter where we would be," she replied, looking at the infinite sky. "It matters where we are now, and we are home." And they truly were. A home built not of bricks and cement, but of daily choices of love, courage to face old pains, and faith that even the most difficult stories can have beautiful endings when the right people meet at the right time. The girl who once observed a suffering stranger and decided that she couldn't just stand by and watch had become a young woman who professionally transformed suffering into hope. And the family that was born of trauma and impossible coincidence had become a source of healing for dozens of other children who needed to discover that they also deserved happy endings. In the stars of that night, if anyone knew how to read the right signs, they could see the complete story. A courageous girl, a broken man who learned to be a father, a woman who recovered her strength, and all the children whose lives were transformed because someone chose to believe that true love is one that multiplies when it is shared. It was, finally, the happy ending that everyone deserved from the beginning. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, please comment giving a score from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.